What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about the most underrated Tyranid units in the new 9th Ed Tyranids Codex. These are units that aren't as obviously powerful as the ones we talked about in our previous video about the best units in the Codex. This actually might end up being kind of like an honorable mention list for that video. These are units that may be likely to fly under the radar and may only be good in specific situations. And several of them I also discounted when initially reading the Codex, but as I've been playing more games, they have been super powerful. As always, if you enjoy my Tyranids content, please consider dropping a like on the video, maybe a subscribe down below, maybe even a comment telling me what your favorite units in the Tyranid Codex are. And let's get into the video. And let's start with the Malaceptor. Now, this guy's mostly in here because I didn't talk about him in the list of best units in the Codex. And to be honest, when I first did my initial Codex review, I sort of dismissed it. I don't love this guy. I don't know if I'll be playing him outside of like some fun lists, because I don't know if trying to deal a bunch of mortal wounds to your opponent is like super duper consistent. The loss of encephalic diffusion, its -1 strength to ranged attacks aura, means that as a defensive piece, the Malaceptor is significantly less useful than it was in the previous version. That said, Malaceptors are much more offensively oriented, using their psychic overload to deal ridiculous numbers of mortal wounds to things even through walls and out of line of sight. That makes Malaceptors much more of an offensive unit and one of the premier mortal wound delivery systems, not only in the Tyranids faction, but also in the game. Please go watch my video about the Tyranid Psychic phase that I released last week, where I have a whole section dedicated to the Malaceptor combo, but long story short, with a combination of Neurothropes, the Malaceptor's own imperative, using High Fleet Leviathan's Hive Nexus psychic power to give himself his own imperative. But long story short, with the application of Warp Siphon, the Neurothrope imperative, and High Fleet Leviathan's Hive Nexus power to give the Malaceptor its own synaptic imperative, this guy can be dumping upwards of 15 to 20 mortal wounds out each psychic phase, which is pretty dumb. Staple that to a 15 wound T8 chassis with pretty reasonable offensive stats at its top bracket, hitting on 3s with between 2d3 damage melee attacks or 2 damage melee attacks with a pretty high AP value. These guys can get stuck into a fight, survive a little bit, continue to pump out mortal wounds, and be relatively dangerous to anything engaging them. Malaceptors are awesome, and you're going to see them quite a bit. And to combo with that, let's talk about another unit that I've been taking pretty often alongside Malaceptors, and that is the Tyrannocyte. The Tyrannocyte's base profile from the previous version of the Codex has been pretty significantly improved. It's now 15 wounds, benefits from that sweet upgraded Death Spitter profile for AP2, and has actually appreciable melee output, in addition to being movement 8 instead of the previous version movement 6, which is actually pretty easy to get stuck in combat. So for no additional cost, that alone makes Tyrannocytes a little bit more exciting to look at. Although I will, to be fair, point out that the 15 wound cap on Tyrannocytes is actually a pretty big downside for them, because it does mean that they give up 3 points on Bring It Down rather than the previous version's 2 points, meaning that they are a much higher priority target for your opponent to take out, assuming that you have a lot of monsters in your list, which a lot of Tyranid lists will have. But the big upgrade of the Tyrannocyte from the previous version of the Codex is its ability to deep strike on the top of turn 1. Tyrannocytes now are just Space Marine drop pods, full stop, very little difference between the two, which means that they can be used to keep your offensive pieces off the table so that you are immune to an alpha strike, or use them to project your threat up the table so you can use them as a bit of a beta strike. I personally like putting a Malaceptor in the Tyrannocyte. It means your combo's not quite as good because the Malaceptor's base abilities are not on the table in the command phase when you need them. But that said, the downside of the Malaceptor is its slow speed and being able to deep strike it wherever you need to and potentially survive a turn to do it again. The subsequent turn with the full combo enacted means that they're going to be able to do a ton of damage. You can also be dropping ranged units like Exocrines out of these guys to keep them safe on turn 1. You don't even have to put models in the Tyrannocyte, so if you just want to use it as a piece to deep strike in the back quarters of the table, do a little bit of shooting, and maybe score secondaries like engage in all fronts, for 100 points you could be doing a lot worse than this guy. Most of my Tyranid lists have ended up including a Tyrannocyte just for the utility that they give you. Being able to deep strike turn 1 is absolutely insane. Another utility unit that flew under the radar for a lot of Tyranid players in this new codex is Genestealers. These guys are not quite as powerful or ubiquitous as the previous version of the unit. In the past codexes, they have been troops options, and their melee output for a relatively cheap troops option was absolutely phenomenal. In addition to the ability to double move, advance, and charge, their threat range was very long, and Genestealers formed the core of a lot of Tyranid archetypes. No longer, now Genestealers are much more of a utility unit, much more of a tech piece, but they bring something to the faction that no other unit can, and that is their Vanguard deployment ability, allowing them to deploy up the table outside of your deployment zone. This is something that Tyranids have basically never had access to, having to jump through a bunch of hoops to use the Spore Field stratagem in the previous version of the Codex to even try to get access to an ability like this, which often ended up making your army so bad that it didn't even matter you could forward deploy. Genestealers now, for just 80 points, can put 5 models up in the middle of the table, meaning that if they go first, they can be onslaughted through the Synaptic Link, run up and charge and try to engage some enemy units, contest their objectives, maybe clear some of their objective holders. But even going second, you can screen out enemy deep strikes or enemy forward deploy, making it much more difficult to alpha strike your army. I think a lot of Tyranid lists are going to be including at least 1 unit of Genestealers, if not 2, especially given how prevalent forward deploy and turn 1 deep strike style armies are going to become. I don't think Genestealers are a particularly phenomenal unit in and of themselves, but the fact that they bring a pretty reasonable damage output and this utility is a super duper big deal. And we'll continue talking about utility units by talking about the Pyrovore. This thing was almost never seen in the previous version of the Codex, despite the fact that it wasn't actually that bad. It was a 28-point model with a heavy flamer, which, I mean, you don't really want to spend, but the ability to take single model units is one of the most powerful in Warhammer 40,000. However, in the new Codex, they've retained that ability, able to be taken in units of 1 for just 30 points, and their profile is efficiency made manifest. They have super high resilience for their 30-point cost at 5 wounds with toughness 5 and 3+ armor save. They can go to a 2+ armor save and cover, meaning that even enemy small arms is not going to be able to remove these guys. They're going to have to dedicate some really powerful anti-tank or charge them to get rid of a Pyrovore that's sitting on a flank somewhere. Even charging into them is a little bit dangerous because these guys have an absolutely insane ranged attack. Their acid spray now ends up being a 2d6 range 18 strength 4 AP1 flamer or a 1d6 range 12 strength 6 AP2 2 damage flamer, which has the ability to dent even heavy targets. The damage output isn't necessarily what you're bringing them for. You're bringing them for the ability to sit in a corner, screen out your opponents, do actions on objectives, act as another unit holding an objective, be able to run around and grab secondary objectives like Stranglehold by taking objectives in the early game, being deployment drops. They're just insane. Any free elite slot that you have in a Tyranid army, which, to be fair, isn't that many because the Tyranid elites are super good in this new codex, should be filled by a Pyrovore, and it's actually potentially worth considering dropping some other elite units for additional Pyrovores. I think 1 to 2 is going to be a staple in almost every Tyranid list, and these things are absolutely ridiculous. Now, we'll move on from Pyrovores to something a little bit harder hitting. Let's talk about Raveners. Raveners suffer a little bit because of the direct comparison with Tyranid Warriors, which are very efficient, if slow, and have pretty good ranged output. Raveners, for 5 points more, unfortunately move to the fast attack slot rather than troops, meaning they lack not only the objective secured ability, but also that important synapse keyword to extend your synaptic links. That said, they make up for that with some absolutely unreasonable stats. Equipped with Scything Talons, these things have 7 attacks in melee, 5 of their base profile of AP2, and then the 2 Scything Talon attacks at AP1. In addition, they can also equip a Death Spitter for free without replacing any of those weapons. All you lose is an ability to get reroll once to hit, but with the core keyword, Raveners could already be getting those rerolls from a Hive Tyrant, meaning you're not really missing out on anything anyway. With a grand total of 10 attacks per turn, being able to shoot 3 times with the Death Spitter, as well as 7 attacks in melee, these things are infantry blenders and can even put a pretty hefty hit onto a bigger unit given the volume of attacks that they can be putting out. You can give them rerolls to hit, reroll ones to wound, potential objective secured from Swarmlord to make up for the deficiencies and the abilities these guys have. And with that movement of 12, being able to rocket them around the table with Onslaught, they're absolutely phenomenal. They're not even that easy to kill. with 4 wounds at toughness 5, only a 4+ save, but -1 to be hit in melee, meaning that if a big unit of Raveners is sinking into the center of the table, the opposing counterattack is going to have a tough time getting through that boatload of wounds that you're bringing. Raveners are just great. They're also a good utility unit. Being fast and infantry means they can run around, do actions, again, screen out your deployment zone, potentially redeploy using Encircle the Prey because they have the Burrowers keyword. They're just super good. Now, a little bit more of an interesting pick on this list, I have the Tyranid Prime. Despite the fact most of the HQ options in the Tyranid Codex are pretty powerful psychers, and the Tyranid Prime and its buddy the Trigon Prime are the 2 exceptions to that, which makes them kind of the odd when considering Tyranid characters. But I found that I very much enjoyed having a Tyranid Prime in my army and have a tough time giving them up. The upside of these guys is that they don't generally take an HQ slot, since you're almost always going to have warriors in your army, and warriors will unlock a free slot for these dudes. They do compete almost directly with a unit of Tyranid warriors. They have the ability to equip a Venom Cannon themselves for no additional cost, meaning that for 85 points you get a pretty decent melee body and that Venom Cannon, as well as the Synapse keyword, which is very important. A unit of 3 warriors has a little bit more range and melee damage output with additional Death Spitters and a Venom Cannon in there. Obviously at worse stats, but with that objective secured ability. So the direct comparison between taking a Tyranid Prime and taking more warriors or something like Raveners is certainly a concern. That said, I found it very difficult to give up my Tyranid Prime simply because of all of the utility that he adds to your army. Getting a reroll once to wound on a unit of Tyranid warriors oftentimes brings back that damage output you would be missing from taking a bunch of dudes with Death Spitters. Having a 2+ ballistic skill, 2 damage gun in the back, sitting in the back of your army and being able to tag enemy units to inflict a little bit more damage where you need it is awesome, especially in a high fleet like Leviathan that has its Master Artisan style reroll, meaning that he is going to be firing those 3 shots with a reroll to hit, so his gun is very high consistency, and his Psychic Imperative is absolutely phenomenal, giving you exploding 6s to hit. For those who don't know, exploding 6s to hit is mathematically equivalent to +1 to hit, so he's essentially giving your entire army a situational +1 to hit with all of your guns for a turn, which is an immense swath of damage you wouldn't get anywhere else. You can even unlock combos like using Observer Organism on an Exocrine, plus this ability, potentially with the Hive Nexus, psychic power from High Fleet Leviathan to let Exocrines Tesla their 6s to hit, which when combined with the High Fleet Leviathan reroll makes them much more consistent than they normally would be. If you're just taking a mass of warriors or other ranged units, the ability to unlocking this imperative and burying your opponent in a hail of Death Spitter fire is also certainly a legitimate strategy, and without the Tyranid Prime would not be on the table. As much as he does compete with a lot of the 70 to 90 point Tyranid utility units like warriors, Raveners, Pyrovores, Genestealers that we just talked about in this video, I've found myself not really being able to remove the Tyranid Prime from my army. And with that, let's move on to our next unit and the last one for this video. Let's talk about the Mawloc. Mawlocs are a super weird unit, and they're really easy to dismiss out of hand because of the paragraphs and paragraphs of text that they have on their datasheet because of their special ability. Essentially, these big snaky boys can set up in reserve, then in your command phase, you can pick a region of the table for them to pop up in. You can do this in your first turn, you'll then wait a turn, so it'll be at the start of your second turn, and in your reinforcement step, the Mawloc will orbital strike the point that you picked, then set up anywhere within 12 inches of the center point of that area. This means that Mawlocs will be dealing damage even before they hit the table, although their primary use case, in my opinion, isn't necessarily going to be doing damage. They're just getting additional work done on your opponent, forcing them to move out of the way of the Mawloc's explosion, then placing themselves on the table. The big upside here is that while they do deep strike, what they're not required to do is deep strike 9 inches away from enemies. The only restriction is that if they don't deep strike 9 inches away, they can't charge that turn, so you can't, unfortunately, make unfailable charges out of Deep Strike with a Mawloc. That said, what it does let you do is place on objectives that your opponent is currently controlling. This means that any high fleet, for example Behemoth, that has the Lurk biomorphology available to it, can use Territorial Instincts to count all of their monsters as objective secured, and monsters the size of the Trigon will count as 5 models for determining control of objective markers. This means that Mawlocs can be placed on objective markers that your opponent is currently holding, as long long as the objective marker isn't covered in their units and their engagement range doesn't encompass the entirety of the objective marker, the Mawloc is probably going to be able to fit a toe on there, and as long as 5 models would outnumber whatever your opponent has on that objective, you'll steal it away from them. This means that for 125 points, the Mawloc can be putting a relatively beefy body with 14 wounds and toughness 7, -1 to be hit in melee, and the potential to be upgraded with a 4+ invulnerable save from Dermic Symbiosis on an objective, taking it away from them immediately, potentially getting you secondaries like Stranglehold, reducing their primary objective score, and then forcing you to deal with it. For 125 points, this guy is not very expensive for all that utility, and you have to remember, he's also already Orbital Strike their army when that happened. If things get hairy for him, you can then, in subsequent turns, use Encircle the Prey to put him back in reserve, and then use his Terror from the Deep again. I have noted in the past that his Burrower keyword isn't exactly the same as the Burrowers keyword that the Encircle the Prey stratagem requires, but as some eagle-eyed viewers pointed out, something I forgot in the past is that bolded keywords don't care about pluralization, so Burrowers and Burrower are, according to the game, essentially the same keyword, meaning that this guy is absolutely targetable by Encircle the Prey, letting you set up multiple Terror from the Deep strikes in a single game. With an absolutely massive 16 attacks at Strength 7 AP 1, although only 1 damage to be fair, as well as the ability to deal D3 mortal wounds at the start of each combat, and an additional attack with its 2 damage Toxin Spike, Mawlocs have a bevy of damage they can deal, and especially against light infantry. Once Mawlocs sit on the table and start fighting, they're actually going to mince things up, especially if you buff their damage in any way. For example, that Behemoth subfaction ability to get +1 strength on the charge, or the Unstoppable Hunger psychic power to give them +1 to wound. These guys are going to be hitting super hard, even against high toughness targets. Especially in Behemoth lists or other lists that have access to that Lurk biomorphology, I think Mawlocs are a must-have in your army, and I would look to include at least one in most armies designed using those high fleets. And that's it! That's all I have to say about the underrated units in the Tyranid Codex. Let me know down below if you have any additional entries that you think should be added to this list. I want to thank everyone for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all those people who help me keep the lights on while I'm talking about Tyranids. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.